that they should fear, and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Don't be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He isn't here because he's been raised from the dead, just as he said. Come see the place where they laid him. Now hurry and go and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead. He's going on ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. I've given the message to you." More?
Yep.
With great fear and excitement, they hurried away from the tomb and ran to tell his disciples. But Jesus met them and greeted them. They came and grabbed his feet and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers that I'm going into Galilee. They will see me there."
So this is quite different from Mark on several accounts. One is it's an appearance, because Jesus actually appears to the women. In the Gospel of Matthew, there are two appearances. This one with Jesus and the women, and then later we will read one about Jesus and the disciples in Galilee. Second thing that's probably even more significant, Matthew does not have the notion of the failure of the disciples or the failure of the women. So the women do what they're told to do, and that is they go to the disciples and tell them what has happened. That doesn't work very well either, because the disciples don't believe them. But they do go and tell the story. So it's not a story about apostolic failure in the same way that it is in Mark. The other thing that I think just is worth noting is that there's another earthquake, of course, because the stone gets rolled away by the angel. Angels can do anything, you know. And there's an earthquake, and the guards are like dead men. They are wiped out. So this is kind of a different story, different slant, if you wish, of Matthew and the coming upon the empty tomb. Anything anybody wants to say about that? Yes.
Yeah, I noticed as we were reading through here, there is no mention of anyone trying to embalm Jesus.
No, that comes.
Not Joseph and the women. That's not why they went to the tomb.
Yeah, they come with spices, but that's more emphasized in the Gospel of Luke rather than here.
Okay, but did I miss it? I don't think it says that here.
No, it says Mary Magdalene, Mary went to the tomb, and you're right. There's no mention of them coming with embalming spices. Remember, we did that last time.
Yeah, that was.
And I was informed. We remember we had this interesting question about, was it 100 pounds of spices or 75 pounds? I was told that in the Roman way of measuring weight, a pound was 12 ounces. So if you have 100 pounds that are 12 ounces, and you get 75. So you're right. There's no mention about coming there with embalming spices. They're just coming to visit the empty tomb. All right, any other comments about that early part? So next, let's get back to the guards and what they do about it. Verse 11 through 15.
Now, now when they were going, behold, some of the watch came into the city and showed unto the chief priests all the things that were done. And when they were assembled with the elders and had taken counsel, they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, Say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. How much further?
That's it. So, I mean, here we have the real conspiracy theory, if you wish. It's not only us who deal with conspiracy theories, it was there. So they were, and it's interesting, they said they were sleeping, which in Roman culture, if you were sleeping at the helm, you could be executed. But they admit that they were sleeping. So it's a kind of a different kind of thing. All right, so let's go to verse 16, because this is where it's only in Matthew that the disciples go to Galilee and meet with Jesus in Galilee. All of the other resurrection stories, including the Gospel of John, are all taking place in Jerusalem. So this account of Matthew is the only one where they meet up in Galilee. So start with verse 16. And let's just go through the rest of it.
The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. When they saw him, they worshiped, but they doubted. Then Jesus approached them and said to them, All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age.
So this little text right here is often referred to as the Great Commission, but it's a story about the disciples being commissioned to go forth into all the world. And we have a similar kind of thing in the Gospel of Luke's story. So they came to Jesus. There's no indication in Matthew's version of an ascension. That only comes in the Gospel of Luke and the companion book of Acts. So Jesus meets with them in Galilee and gives them the Great Commission. Yes.
The Trinity already? Baptizing
That's-
them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
This is one of the earliest references, if you wish, of the Trinitarian formula. Because elsewhere, there is emphasis on the God the Father and Jesus the Messiah, but not that Trinitarian formula. So this Trinitarian formula, particularly connected to baptism, traces its roots, if you wish, to the Gospel of Matthew. The other thing I would point out is the disciples go to the mountain where Jesus told them. In the Gospel of Matthew, mountain experiences appear often, don't they? What are some of them? Transfiguration is a mountaintop experience. Sermon on the Mount is on a mountaintop. So Matthew's gospel has all kinds of mountain experiences. And if you were into psychology, Abraham Maslow is all about mountaintop experiences, because those are aha experiences. And there is a kind of a geographical thing that if you're going up a mountain, you're closer. If God is up there, you're closer to God. So that mountaintop is a pretty important theme in the Gospel of Matthew. So that is most of what I think we need to say about the Gospel of Matthew. Anybody have any more comments or questions about what Matthew does? Yes.
Yeah, you may have directed my thinking with your mention of Doceticism earlier.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, but looking at this, thinking Matthew's maybe sort of telegraphing his moves here, some kind of back on the women going to the tomb, but nobody's anointed or prepared Jesus' body for burial. And maybe that's Matthew's way of telling us we don't need to do that because you're not going to be there anyway.
It could be. That's a
you're
good
gonna be
point.
the risen. And then he, the next appearance is in Galilee. So he's moved a long ways. But kind of like Elijah, he just shows up.
It's
We don't know how to-
it's not like a day's journey
Yeah.
up to Grand Haven. It's
Yeah,
a long
he
way.
gets, he gets there, and then almost immediately we have this developed Trinitarian formula,
Uh-huh.
with both the Trinity and the baptism in Jesus' name, which are both kind of introduced, and so it's like we get very quickly to the resurrected divine Christ.
It's
And,
almost like the writer of Matthew was like Mark, in a hurry to get the story out there.
Yeah,
And in a hurry to get the disciples commissioned to go into all the world, because that's a theme of Matthew. Matthew, remember, was very much a gospel for the Jewish Christian community. And so this is really, there's other hints in the Gospel of Matthew, but this is really taking it from, okay, guys, you have to move away from Jerusalem. You have to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. So it's, that's a really important point.
And you're only 11, Thomas is missing.
Right. Judas is missing. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thomas is still there. He's still being but we don't get the same thing about Thomas like we do in Mark's gospel. So, all right. So I think let's move on to the Gospel of Luke's account. So similarly, in Luke, we will begin with 23:49. The resurrection story proper begins in chapter 24, but 23:39 or 49 begins the account of the women before. So if somebody would read verse 49, and then we'll go on to the rest of that chapter of chapter 23.
Now there was a man named Joseph who was a member of the council. He was a good and righteous man. He hadn't agreed with the plan and actions of the council. He was from the Jewish city of Arimathea and eagerly anticipated God's kingdom. This man went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Taking it down, he wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb carved out of the rock in which no one had ever been buried. It was the preparation day for the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was quickly approaching. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph. They saw the tomb and how Jesus' body was laid in it. Then went away and prepared fragrant spices and perfumed oils. They rested on the Sabbath in keeping with the commandment.
So there in this story, Joseph of Arimathea is not a disciple, but he's a good man. So he's not even identified as one of the members of the Sanhedrin, which Mark does, but he's identified as a good man. And just to back up one verse that Joni did not read, and it's verse 49, but all his acquaintances, including women, had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. All his acquaintances. So in Luke's version, not only is there a failure of the disciples, but they're part of this crowd, his acquaintances watching from a distance. So there's a different nuance about what it was to be a disciple from Luke's account. All right, the tomb story is very similar to Mark and Matthew. So there's not a great deal of redaction emphasis in Luke's account. Only that they're different than in Matthew. The women go home to prepare the spices, similar to Mark's account. Okay? Yeah.
I noticed here, we didn't read it, but I noticed just a little bit earlier, there is the one verse we saw from Matthew about the temple curtain being torn,
Oh, yeah.
although
right.
none of the other stuff,
Uh-huh.
just that one verse.
Which in Matthew, at least, that's important because Matthew looks at the temple curtain as being the breakaway finally of Jewish law and the coming forth of Jesus as a new day. So it's an important part of Matthew's account. Yes, thank you. All right. Next, let's go to 24. And we'll do it through verse 12. 24, 1 through 12.
On the first day of the week at dawn, the women came to the tomb bringing the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled back from the tomb. But when they entered the tomb, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were still at a loss over what to think of this, two men in dazzling garments stood beside them. Terrified, the women bowed to the ground. The men said to them, "Why do you search for the living one among the dead? He is not here. He has been raised up. Remember what he said to you while you were in Galilee, that the Son of Man must deliver into the hands of sinful men and must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." With this reminder, his words came back to them. On their return from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and the others. The women were Mary of Magdalene, of Magdala, Joanna and Mary, the mother of James. The other women with them also told the apostles, but the story seemed like nonsense, and they refused to believe them. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. He stooped down, but could not, but could see nothing but the wrappings. So he went away full of amazement at what had occurred.
All right, so here we have an account that is not totally different from what we've heard elsewhere, except that it's the angels, not Jesus, who do the teaching about remember what he told you, this is must happen, because it's referring back to the passion predictions that are in Mark and Matthew and Luke. So they are reminded of them, but there's no appearance, at least in this part of the story, of Jesus to the women. We got that in the Gospel of John's account, where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, remember? And she thought he was the gardener. So then the other thing that's interesting in this particular story, Peter goes, good old Peter, he needs to be redeemed, you know, and he sees the clothes lying. Now, the nuance that I have read is that the clothes are almost like the clothes that the body was wrapped in, but the body isn't there. So they're lying there, not thrown off, they're just lying there as if the body escaped out of them, which is the way that Luke tries to emphasize the resurrection. Yes.
Who's Joanna? Because all of a sudden we have a Joanna.
Well, and she appeared in, no, we had Salome in one of the earlier accounts. There's no, I've never been able to pick up anything that says, you know, this is who Joanna was. So obviously in the tradition that both Matthew and Luke get, and even Mark, there is a Salome, there is a Johanna, there's different Marys, Mary, the mother of James, and then we had the mother of the Sons of Zebedee. So there's different women that are mentioned, but always Mary Magdalene. And hence why in the earliest church, Mary Magdalene was looked at as the first of the disciples, because she was the first one who saw Jesus and interacted with Jesus. And so she gets demoted later on, but at the very earliest, she was there. So then let's see if anything else we want to say about Luke's account. Peter goes to the empty tomb, but there's no indication of him seeing Jesus. But later on, we will get an account of that, of saying, oh, Peter did see Jesus, but there's no resurrection story of that. It's just Peter did see Jesus. So now we come to, in my mind, the most delightful resurrection story, the road to Emmaus story. So let's pick it up at 13 and go through, actually the whole story goes through verse 35. So we ought to read the whole story because it's great. Yeah.
There's a comment about Joanna.
Oh, okay.
It just, yeah, the comment disappeared.
Well, maybe it'll come back.
Okay, I see it back here. So Mary Voss says, in my Bible, Joanna is noted as the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, AMP.
Shade what?
Joanna is noted as the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward.
That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that, but that's an interesting piece to look up. Thank you. All right, so somebody read the Emmaus story.
Now that very day, two of them were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, what are you discussing as you walk along? They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days? And he replied to them, what sort of things? They said to him, the things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty indeed in word before God and all the people. How our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it is now the third day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see. And he said to them, oh, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us? So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, the Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon. Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
So what I have found fascinating in reading the commentaries on this, they do one of two things. One is they try to conflate this story with the other stories. And they don't, in my mind, do a very good job of it, but they try to do that. The second thing that they are prone to do is to get stuck on place names. So Emmaus, there's no Emmaus in the geography of Jerusalem of those times. And so they try to figure out, well, it must have been this town or it must have been that town and so on. And then they also get stuck on the name Cleopas, because there's two of them and only Cleopas has a name. And so they try to figure out, well, who was Cleopas and where did he come from and how did he get into the picture? What I find fascinating is that few of them take the story just for what it is, a delightful story, and one that is probably, I think, had more mileage, if you wish, in terms of creation or resurrection stories than almost any of the other stories. But that's what, that's what biblical scholars try to do. They try to wrestle out all of this other information, and sometimes they get stuck doing that. So that's the Emmaus story. The other point I would make out of this, and we will get more of this as we go on, it was in the meal with, and these are the three words for if you're a preacher like these two guys: you take, you bless, you break, and you give. Those are the four words of the action of Eucharist. And it's in doing that that they suddenly see who Jesus is. So it's a very Eucharistic, if you wish, story, and parallels other Eucharistic stories that are floating around throughout the gospel accounts. But here it is, particularly in this story of Emmaus. So somebody was going to say, there we go.
In this story, Jesus is invited to stay and eat with them.
Right.
So we have Jesus eating.
Yeah, we're going to get to the eating thing in a moment, because there's a very interesting little account by one of my commentators, Gerald Collins, interpreting the resurrection, explaining the major problems of the stories of Jesus' resurrection. And the title of his one that we'll spend some time is, Did Jesus Eat Fish? So there's several sort of uncertainties about Jesus, but what is clear is Jesus at meal with the disciples is not an uncommon theme. Think of the feeding of the 5,000 story. That's Jesus and the disciples, and multiplying the fish and the bread and feeding a vast horde of people. That's very Eucharistic, because that's what Eucharist is about, is the feeding of people with the broken body and blood of Jesus. So yeah. So that's, that is part of it. They invite Jesus to the meal, and then he does the Eucharistic message. The other thing that will come up later when we look at Jesus and eating of fish, Jesus has a knack of appearing and disappearing. So the gospel writers want to make in some way explicit that Jesus really is a bodily resurrection, but then he's always appearing and disappearing, which is, of any of us with bodies can't do that. So there's something very different about Jesus's resurrection. And it might correlate, if you wish, from that earlier account of the dead rising from the tombs and appearing in Jerusalem. What kind of bodies did they have? How did they appear? What did they do? Well, it depends on how literally minded you are and how you deal with that. But so, what else do I want to say about this? Now, I'm not going to read it, but you know that the Gospel of Luke was also, or the writer of the Gospel, Luke, is also the writer of the book of Acts. And so in Acts, there is a resurrection story, just like we will hear here in Luke, but it's a little different story, but written by the same author. So then let us go to verse 36. And maybe we'll just read it through until the end of the chapter. Or maybe just 36 through 43, and then we'll read the rest of it later.
While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence.
All right, there we got the Jesus eating the fish story, which this writer who wrestles with that has some interesting things to say about it. First of all, I'm going to just read these rather than having somebody read it, but you know that Acts is written by the same author. So in Acts 1 and 4, this is Luke's summary of the resurrection appearances. While staying, the word that gets translated as staying can also be translated as eating. So while staying with them, he ordered them not to leave Jerusalem, but to stay, to wait there for the promise of the Father, which is the Pentecost event. So that's in verse 4 of chapter 1. And then in chapter 10, there's another reference to staying and eating. Verse 41 says, then God raised him on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to all the people, but to those of us who were chosen by God as witnesses, and who ate and drank. So Jesus, according to the writer, and this would be Peter's story, that Jesus ate and drank with the people. So this Eucharistic element of Jesus eating and drinking with the disciples fits in with the Eucharistic theology of Luke, as well as any of the other New Testament writers. So now, the comment that he makes is in 1 Corinthians 13:15, Paul is talking about the difference between a physical body and a spiritual body. And he does it in this fashion. Not all flesh is alike, but there is one body of flesh for human beings and another for animals, another for birds and another for fish. They are both heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly body is one thing, and that of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. And then he talks about it as being a spiritual body. So if Jesus has a spiritual body, and when you can think of that in terms of Jesus going in and out of rooms without doors, etc., it is a spiritual body, but it appears like our bodies. So this introduces a term that some of you might know if you went to seminary, doceticism. Anybody familiar with that word? Doceticism was one of the groups, or one of the theological groups in Jesus' time, soon after it, which said basically Jesus, as the Son of God, could not physically experience the death on the cross. It would be impossible. And so therefore, Doceticism said he just appeared to undergo the death on the cross. But he really could not, because he was spirit. So that's one of the little things, nuances, if you wish, in this whole conversation about, did Jesus eat fish? And his conclusion, by the way, is to take it back to the Eucharistic meal, and saying that is so fundamental, so foundational to the Christian gospel, that Jesus eating fish, forget about whether our bodies, our digestive bodies, can digest fish. He could eat fish because it was a spiritual body rather than a temporal physical body. It's a fascinating sort of conversation about Jesus eating fish. Jesus, how do we look at Jesus with a physical body, and yet it was a spiritual body? It's one of the struggles we have in dealing with the resurrection. Wait, here it comes.
I just was going to ask for that reference from Corinthians.
Oh, Corinthians 15, it begins at verse 42 and then goes on from there.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is important is this part of the gospel stories, Gospel Luke. And keep in mind that Luke has a physicality to him, hence he was called the doctor, because there is a physicality to Luke that is not there in the other gospels, particularly the Gospel of John. So for Luke to have Jesus eating fish would connect to that physicality, which would not be there in the other gospels. It's a unique story to the Gospel of Luke. All right, I think that's as much as I want to say about Luke and Matthew, but I'm wondering if anyone wants to make any comments about the whole journey we have been doing with resurrection stories for the last 4 weeks.
I think just to reiterate the role of women compared to the role of disciples and the changes that happened in the early church that kind of swept away the true role that those women had played.
I think that's a very important point. And the feminist scholarship on the Gospels didn't really begin until mid 20th century. And that was an important part of feminist theology, was to say the role of women is there in the Bible, but it has been de-emphasized because men have taken over the story. So it's his story, history, not her story, you know. So, John.
Yeah, I just think of not only the resurrection, but a lot of stories that one perspective is to take everything literally.
Yeah.
Another perspective is to denounce it all. It doesn't make any sense, but there's a mythological truth and, you know, poetic truth to these stories that we can learn from without either taking it literally or denouncing the literalism.
Yeah, and I think that is what certainly Norman Perrin, the article I gave you at the very beginning, tries to do in talking about myth as a way of reading the resurrection stories. It's one of my favorite New Testament scholars, still no longer alive, was Marcus Borg, which really said the Bible is true, but it may not be literally true. And I found that to be very significant in terms of going through the biblical stories. And I think you particularly see that in terms of journeying through the resurrection stories of the New Testament.
There's a chat that just came through.
A Chad?
A chat.
Yep. There's a message from Zoom. We usually read a single gospel one at a time. It is fascinating to compare the gospels, really helps my understanding.
Oh, that's such a good point, because we have a 3-year cycle, lectionary people. And so this year we're reading Luke, next year we read Matthew, then we read Mark. We don't read them side by side. There was a book that all seminarians knew about called Throckmorton is the author, and it was titled Gospel Parallels. And in that book, he takes each of these stories and puts them side by side. So you can see how each gospel emphasizes certain things and doesn't emphasize others. And if you're into sort of Googling stuff, you could probably get a used copy of it, because it's one of the tools that, particularly in seminary, where we were sort of more prone, at least I was more prone to take a very literalist view of the gospel, could see this in a black and white perspective. It was really very helpful. Yeah.
I'm still thinking about the raising of Lazarus. I have the voices of Bible teachers in my head, and not seminary teachers, but Bible teachers over the years who made a distinction between the raising of Lazarus and the raising of Jesus. And their point was, well, Lazarus isn't around anymore, is he? So he died again. But so there was something qualitatively different about Jesus' resurrection. But in the way you've taught this class, which I like, you want to stress. Well, maybe I should let you say what you want to stress, but I think that distinction doesn't mean so much to you. The distinction between Lazarus.
I would agree. And I think, as I think I mentioned when we read that story, that in the Gospel of John, where that's the only place that story appears, it was the pivotal point in which the authorities wanted to arrest Jesus and kill him. It's not so in the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, the pivotal point was right at Holy Week when Jesus does the cleansing of the temple, so-called cleansing of the temple. You might even call it the defacing of the temple. So that was what tipped the scales in the synoptic tradition, but not according to John. So the raising of Lazarus, in a certain powerful sense, is not the same, but not totally different from the raising of Jesus.
Many years ago, I visited, one of the supposed places where Lazarus was. There's a few that might have been in. And what we were told is the big difference is, well, Jesus raised Lazarus, but Jesus raised himself when he was resurrected. So Lazarus, maybe wanted to be resurrected, but he didn't do it himself. And then, as you said, of course, he died again. And so some people even have said, if you were Lazarus and you were dead and you were in heaven, why would you, want to come back? So that, it was more Jesus showing it. But then also when you were talking about the eating, and I think we talked about this maybe last time, back during all the miracles, when Jesus raised that little girl, I think Tabitha, the minute, because some people are saying, no, she's already dead. And he's saying, no, she's just sleeping. Well, whichever the case, when he did get her up, he said, now give her something to eat.
Right.
And I think that was kind of along the same line to prove that she wasn't, a ghost.
Right.
And then one last thing, when we were talking, I think John said about the, I'm losing my train of thought, about the gospel. About the Bible, as whether this is true, literal, whatever. And again, we might have talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but I was always taught that it's a library with many books. And so it's got history, it's got law, it's got poetry, it's got fiction, it's got nonfiction, it's got historical fiction. And so I think of it that way. And then to me, it makes sense that some of these things almost sound like contradictions.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with that. And about raising of Lazarus, certainly Jesus was there because Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. And there's nobody at the tomb saying, Jesus, come forth. But if Jesus died and was in the tomb, then we have to say, well, God must have been there. And God said, Jesus, come forth. But that's a theological sort of twist without a historicity of Jesus raising Lazarus. And the other thing I'll say about Lazarus, I at one time in my life was really into fantasy literature. Any of you ever hear the book Canticle of Leibowitz? It was a great book. The basic premises of the book was, it was after the world had been destroyed by an atomic conflagration. And there was this monastic community that was sort of trying to find the history of the civilization that had been destroyed. And in the story, Lazarus, who had never died, was appearing in the story. It is a fascinating little story. I don't know if it's related at all to this. I don't think so, but anyway, a little aside. So were you going to say something?
Thinking one thing that goes through all of these stories, and the various writers handle it differently. I'm thinking back, teaching a confirmation class one time, and I had a student in there, a young woman who was very intelligent, but not a whole lot of church background. And as we're going through this, she says, I got a question. You talk about Jesus, and we read about Jesus in the Gospels, and we got all these stories of Jesus. And then we talk about Christ, this risen heavenly being. Are we talking about one person or two people?
Ah,
And what's the
yeah.
relation between them?
Mhm,
And it seems like that's really the question here.
mhm.
The writers, the early church people had an experience of the risen Lord's a heavenly being, and they're trying to feel their way into how do we describe, how we got from the Jesus that we followed or that others followed, and we got the heavenly being, and just how do we get from one to the other, and what's the relation? So we have these these stories here where sometimes the risen Lord looks just like he did when he was Jesus before the crucifixion, and sometimes he looks like he's just a spirit,
Mhm,
and oftentimes he's kind of a little of both.
mhm.
And it seems like maybe this is what the writers are trying to do, is to try to sort this out for us.
Well, and I think so. And we so often hear those two names together, Jesus Christ. But Jesus refers to a real historical person, whereas Christ is a theological concept. It's an attempt to try to say, what is the significance of Jesus coming and living and dying and rising again? That's where Christ comes from. But we tend to use them together as if it's first and last name.
I have a couple questions. Matthew, was he the apostle that was a lawyer or something? I mean, they gave some things when they were introduced. I'm not sure whether he was the one that was a lawyer.
No, let's say at the offset, we don't know anything about any of the authors.
Okay.
To try to track them down to disciples or apostles. In fact, sometimes the names they were given were attached because of something in the gospel story. So in the gospels, Jesus, and I can't remember which account is now, but he talks to a tax collector who's at his booth doing his thing, and Jesus says to him, come follow me. So that's how Matthew got attached to that name.
Okay.
But there's no historical connection between that story of the calling of Matthew the tax collector and Matthew the author of the Gospel of Matthew. Because
there-
all of these
Okay.
gospel stories were written many years after, presumably the people who had those names were no longer alive.
Is there any looking into where these apostles were when they wrote their
No, the only way that they do that is by looking at the style of writing, the supposed congregation or focus of the story. And so, for example, to go back to Matthew, because Matthew has so many allusions to the Old Testament, that most scholars believe that Matthew was writing to a Christian Jewish community who knew the Old Testament well and could make correlations between what they knew of the Old Testament and what Matthew's gospel does. For example, just to give one quick little illustration, in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5 books. Jesus in Matthew has 5 major teaching experiences. The first, the best known, is of course the Sermon on the Mount, but then there's 4 other major teaching experiences, and biblical scholars can say, well, here's Matthew replicating, if you wish, the 5 books of the Torah. So that's Matthew's version. Mark, because Mark was captivated by the destruction of Jerusalem, as any of us would be. I mean, it would be like the destruction of what's going on now with the Soviet Union. That was the immediate aftermath of the Gospel of Mark, and it was probably written to a group of Christians who were expecting the parousia, the second coming of Jesus, to happen almost any time. So Mark is eager to get the story out there, whereas Luke has a very different kind of orientation. We often refer to Luke as the healer, not because there's one reference in Acts to Luke the physician, but it's no correlation with the writer, but that got attached to Luke. But there's a lot of healing stories in Luke. And so to say Luke the healer would make some kind of sense. And other than Matthew, most of the other Gospels were written to the diaspora, to people who were scattered away from Jerusalem, which was just beginning with the destruction of Jerusalem. So, anything else? Any final words of wisdom?
No, when George talked about confirmation class, I thought about teaching confirmation class. And before they got confirmed, they had to write what they believed about God, what they believed about Jesus, what they believed about the life that they should have. And one girl said, well, I don't think I believe in God. And I asked her, because I had met each one, I asked, well, tell me what you believe about God. And she described various, I don't remember the details, but I remember is, well, I don't believe in that God either.
Boy, you really put them through it to make them write their little credo statement. I thought it wasn't until you got to seminary that you had to write a credo statement. That's good. That's really good. All right. Well, thank you all for being a part of this journey.
Thank you, David.
Douglas, for running around with the microphone.
Yeah, I got my steps in today again.
And next week, I think it's on Wednesday, isn't it, or Tuesday? John is going to navigate us through
Jesus and John Wayne.
Wayne.
Tuesday morning. Thank you for the advertisement. I appreciate that. But should we show our appreciation today?
Well, thank you all. You've been a fun group to be with.
So David, when is your big move going to be taking place?
Not until the end of the year. We had thought it was going to be a little earlier, but the builder that we have contracted with will not start until June. And then his projected completion date will be in November, December.
So we're not losing you.
Not yet, but I am going to teach a course in the fall. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I'm thinking of the title of Sex in Politics. And
It will be a sellout.
and I'm going to be basing it on the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is all about sex, but most people don't realize how much of a political commentary the Song of Songs was.
Where do we sign up?
Thank you, David, for navigating us.
Yep, thank you for coming, everybody.
Well,